Hello everyone and welcome to our March 2025 Q&A. I've got with me Cindy Kraft, the famous and world famous Oasis expert with me and one of the owners of K&K. Cindy, how are you today?
Good. How about you?
I'm doing very well. I'm doing very well. I was really kind of a little bit overwhelmed at all the questions we got this time, so I'm super happy about this session. Are we ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. First one is a documentation question, and it's interesting because I put it at the very top of the list, Cindy, because we see this so often that I thought it would be a great opportunity to share it with the folks that are on this call. As of late, we have had several clinicians asking if they must document in all narrative boxes throughout the OASIS. They are frustrated and feel as if they are double or triple documenting in some cases and would like to just use the check marks in assessment sections. Are there required narrative areas?
So when it comes to OASIS data collection, we know that the only information that's transmitted to CMS is our responses to items that are specific to the OASIS. So that have the appropriate letter and number in front of it. That is ultimately all that is transmitted with an OASIS submission. That being said, OASIS does not require narrative documentation be added. We know that because they don't use it, that we don't send it to them. They don't do anything with it. The issue of it being required, I think the important part of narrative information is to provide some context. I know as an OASIS reviewer, when I look at it and it says things like, yes, we did find a medication issue, and yes, we did two-way communication with the physician in that time frame. But then I look around in the record and I can't find anything that says who was talked to who about what the follow-up piece was. And so that really should be documented somewhere to substantiate that response. The other area I see a lot of is marked that high-risk medication teaching was done. And yet there's nothing there that says what medications to who, did they understand it? None of those details are present. So I think the importance of narrative content is to round out that description. Also, when we think about assessing function in the 1800s versus the GGs, because there are some subtle differences between the wordings of the questions, if we're coming up with two answers that are appropriate but seem a little misaligned, additional documentation can really help there. But to the point of double and triple documenting, Sherry, I think you already know what I'm going to say because I've been kind of on a warpath about this again. But we have to keep in mind, no matter what EMR vendor we're using, they add features and add areas very often at the behest of their clients. And because they want their clients to be happy and continue to use the product, they can accommodate these, especially, if they hear a lot of requests for something or they're a newer emerging EMR and they're really trying to listen to their smaller customer base. But what can happen over time is that all of these requests end up in the same document. And so someone may have said, I wanted it this way, and another bunch of agencies said, well, no, I want it that way. So to appease them both, they put both in there. So what I stress to agencies outside of OASIS, more in just documentation in general, it's important, especially, if you've been using an EMR and they've done an update, for a team or a group of individuals to really look through the tool again, because it is a documentation tool. And we want to make sure we're using the tool effectively and efficiently. So I've seen instances where you go back and look, and it is literally asking the same thing three different ways in three different places. Some clinicians will see that as obligated to write it three times. And you may say from a leadership position, well, we never told them that. Well, you may not have told them that, but you may want to tell them which fields you want them to use and give them permission to ignore other ones. Because I can't be the only one doing internal QA going, hold on a second. I'm trying to figure out where they put this particular piece of information. And one clinician used the first area, the other one did the second one, the other one did the third. The fourth clinician wrote it three times, but slightly different. And then somebody got mad and didn't want to deal with these three boxes, so put it in a fourth spot. It's very hard to then be able to determine if the key elements of documentation are present to defend medical necessity. So I always recommend a group periodically. Let's go through our EMR tool. Okay, do we want them to write here? Do we want them to ignore this? and create that template so the clinician understands that if there's fields that you don't want them to use, that you're giving them permission to skip it. Now, that sounds silly. They should just know, but I find time and time again, the ones that are spending an extraordinary amount of time on documentation that ultimately gets redundant, you are going to need to take a lead. You don't want them to do it because it could turn into a free-for-all. But how does the agency want to use this EMR? What stays in, what goes out, what is okay to just skip because that doesn't really work for us. We want you to put it over here.
And I think
And
sometimes,
that also helps the QA process be streamlined because everybody's agreed where that information should be. So if I go there and it's not there, then I'm going to go back to the clinician and find out what happened.
right. And as we're being bombarded with AI, and as a lot of our clinicians are already using speak to text, whether you know it or not, I hope I'm striking some fear deep into your soul that they are already using speak to text. They're doing it with text on your phone. It's happening very easily into some of these documentation tools. And the biggest thing that I see surrounding this is the ability to edit and the ability of the clinician to edit. Cindy, do you mind speaking to that briefly and how important that is?
Well, I think what we saw is kind of like the conversion from ye old days of paper when we first started using computers in this space. And it was like, this is going to make us more efficient and it's going to be easier to read. And I remember how it exposed quite quickly who couldn't spell. I remember arguing, Sherry, back in the day of, can't you build some like spell check into this so that I'm not looking at these narrative comments that are clearly not spelled correctly? How could we get that fixed? Well, now you add basically gasoline on that situation of voice to text or ambient AI listening in and putting that in there. I'm not critical of either tool. It's just we got to make sure the clinician proofreads what goes in there. Because when we look at records here at K&K, there's things that go in there that you're like, okay, now I think they're talking to their dog. I don't quite know what this means, or it doesn't make any sense because it misunderstood. So it's a tool that can expedite documentation, but what concerns me most is that it's seen by some as it took care of it for me. I don't have to look. So much like the days of make sure you spelled it right, I have now become make sure that's what you actually meant to say.
I hope that they come up with an AI that can write one of my favorite things I've ever found in a chart, which was a cardiac patient that couldn't continue with their therapy because their heart was acting up, and it was the drawing of a heart acting in an arrow up. I wonder if AI can write that. But no, if you think that your clinicians are not great documenters and they're not getting to the point of their documentation, wait till AI gets a hold of it. Make sure that they can edit and they choose to edit and that they look back on what they've done in the EMR and how it presents to the reviewer and just to glance at it to make sure that it makes sense. I mean, I think that that's super important as we tell the story of this patient through the documentation. And if you can get there through checkboxes, bully on you. But there should be some narrative in your charting for sure, that covers a general synopsis of what's going on. And please, please, please have them put the focus of care, right, Cindy?
Yes, we need to have that very clear that everybody knows because that's going to drive the care plan, the coding, and the rest. But before we leave this topic, Sherry, I think the other piece in the same context of I feel like I'm writing things multiple times in the record, we also know there can be some issues related to basically cut and paste features, where the clinician feels it expedites the process to just cut it and copy it in another part of the record. That doesn't add value to see the exact same documentation in multiple boxes. Or when you get to that clinical summary and it's cut and paste from all other parts of the assessment, repeated in there, and then you can't find the focus of care because it's buried in stuff that was written elsewhere. So again, using the tool to say, if this is where I want you to put it, I don't want you to just cut it and repeat it over here. A summary is meant to be, tell me what the focus of care is. What are your primary concerns with this individual? What are the things that are the top priority? It's not just taking stuff and moving it over. And I always find it fascinating when clinicians insist that they're not doing something like that. When I get in records as recently as last week and I see, 10 notes in a row with the same narrative content, with the same typo in the same spot, unless that person has a super special gift to be able to generate that, that very clearly is being cut and paste, note after note after note. And then, yes, there's words in the box, but that's not going to help defend medical necessity.
No, and that was, you brought me to my other thing, was the notorious cut and paste. It's happening.
Mhm.
Whatever the computer can do as far as its word processing abilities, they're doing into the note. And so again, looking back and reviewing your notes and having someone make sure that they make sense, that they read well, because we got to remember the folks that are auditing a lot of this when we turn them in for an ADR or a TPE aren't necessarily clinicians. They cannot read between the lines. And that doesn't mean that they have to write more. It just means they have to write smarter. Cindy, have we kicked this one down the road and beat the dead horse enough yet?
I, but I think it's a good question, and we can get very overwhelmed with the technology and the changes and the advancements, and sometimes feel like, it's dragging us in a direction as opposed to these are tools, and we
Mhm.
want to make sure people are using them correctly and consistently.
And I didn't mean to say the question was a beating the dead horse. I mean to say the issue is beating the dead
Yes.
horse. We have to tell that have the privilege of seeing people one on one in their homes without any supervision. We have to be able to succinctly write the story of why we're in the home and no other setting. And I think that needs to be pushed home with clinicians and with folks in the QA department over and over again, because they need to look like the patients in front of them. They look like the person and the individual in front of them, and not just a bunch of phrases that have been adopted over the years that are very homogeneous. They need to be individual. And so I think it's really important that we strive to do that, and that we edit our documentation accordingly. Okay, Cindy, here we go. Sometimes it is not possible to complete a research visit assessment within the 5-day window. When completing the assessment after the 5-day window, we always get an MD order prior to the end of the cert to state it's okay to do the visit for whatever reason outside the 5-day window, like reassessment visit to be performed blank due to patient request. My question is, can you perform a recert prior to the 5-day recert window if you get an MD order stating it's okay to perform the assessment prior to the recert window?
Now, where some may have found our answer to the very first question was a little long-winded, this one is much shorter. No. The 5-day window is the 5-day window. Physician orders don't exempt us at all. And I think the position is, with a 5-day window, they feel that's pretty generous to be able to get that recertification done. Not being able to do that, yes, things can happen, but it really should be an anomaly. And the guidance manual tells you what you're supposed to do if you are late on that. But no, you cannot do it preemptively, and a physician order will not supersede the expectation. The piece I want to talk about, though, particularly in the way the question's worded, is the example of per patient request. I think this is where we need to potentially revisit the scripting of how we're scheduling this visit with the patient. This really is an issue of, it's an important step in your care. We need to be able to determine if we can or should continue into the next 60-day episode. We need to get a thorough assessment of you. I'd be wondering about this per patient request to delay it, or if they don't think they need a visit, do they need continued skilled care? And this is why it should really be only in completely unforeseen circumstances. I think we need to anticipate it better and plan it, but no, you can't do it sooner.
Okay. As we go further into these OASIS specific questions, I wanted to bring to everybody's attention that we have many products available on MedBridge, but I realized that we hadn't shared those with folks here. And a lot of folks are just nodding because they're like, yes, we've seen Cindy in the house. Yes, we've seen it. But those of you that haven't, it is a very specific type of training. And Cindy, can you explain what we see the best use of this training is?
Well, it gives us the ability, well, okay, let me just back up. A bit of a selfish motivation was, how do you create something that can cover every single OASIS question that doesn't become very long webinars that nobody really wants to sit there that long? And then once I put a new person through that, and I really just need to have them deal with, let's say we're having some problems with the medication question, how do I go back to that? Well, I don't want to listen to a 90-minute thing just to get the one thing that I needed out of it. So we intentionally built this with MedBridge. I kept calling it Lego blocks. that each item is handled individually, so that if you need to look at it from a new hire standpoint, on-demand training to cover the whole thing, it can do that. If you need to revisit certain areas, you can do that. So I like that flexibility. And I like the format of the video component of that visit. Although I have been stopped at conferences by clinicians that say things like, "Oh, I've had to watch hours of you." I'm like, "Oh, wow, they don't even look like they're smiling." They're like they've been tortured with those videos. But we really tried to make it something that knowledge application wasn't just, here's a scenario, answer the question, but can you watch a person moving around in their home and be able to apply what the correct OASIS functional responses would be for them?
I think it's a great product, and it's unique to itself. There's no other out there like that, and it can be put into your LMR and used repeatedly. And I like the way that they've broken it down into modules. Like Cindy said, you can access needed modules versus the entire thing, as it's kind of like a PRN thing. So if you want a demo, you can go to the link and they have the information for the demo. And I think it's a tight it's a tight set of education that can get your clinicians to a better place. And so let's move on to the next question. More OASIS, Cindy, yay!
Yay.
Can you go into more detail of the M0102 and M0104, please? Scenario 1, intake department completed review on 12/14 and got MD orders for SN eval. Patient was DC from hospital on 12/16. How would you answer M0102 or M0104?
Okay, I'm glad we're going to pause there because there's multiple scenarios in the question. So the bottom line is you do not have a physician ordered start of care date in that example the way it is worded. It did not say the doctor said to start on a particular date, so you would be putting non-applicable and skipping 102. For 104, we've been told that the date of referral is in fact the date when we have an actionable complete referral. So although that order was secured on the 12th, the patient was still in the hospital until the 14th. Would we have to have updated documentation indicating that was their date of discharge and we could get an updated order for home care upon the 14th? Yes. You would not want to artificially say, well, we got the order on the 12th, so we're going to put the 12th down in 104. You don't want to do that because you really couldn't see that patient for those 2 days. So there is that flexibility to be able to say if there is, this seems to be reading as a planned discharge on the 14th, but let's say something happened and they changed their mind and said the patient has to stay till the 16th. We would need to get an updated order at the time of discharge, which would then start our 48-hour clock on the day they actually went home.
Mm-hmm. And many times the orders that are written in medical records from a hospital on the discharge order, on the discharge visit of the doctor, they'll put in that part what day they want the home care to start or when they're referring the home care. So it just needs to be a really detailed look at the documentation and not going by the first date you see, because there may be other documentation in those records that you can use as your referral date. Scenario 2, patient was discharged on 110, intake department received MD orders on 110, no specified date, attempted to see patient on 112, however, patient requested start of care to be completed on the 14th. Doctor's office was closed, so unable to make doctor aware. Start of care was completed on 114. What would you do with those two items, M0102 and M0104?
Well, I think there's another issue at play here. If you had a live order on 110 and attempted to contact them on 112, that already is contributing to the delay. Mm-hmm. Because when it goes on to say that because it was on the 12th and the doctor wasn't available to be able to get that, contacting that patient sooner than 48 hours potentially after you got the order has kind of put you behind the 8 ball. Because as the question is written, you reached out to the patient, you tried your best, you explained the importance of home care, again, back to scripting, because I used to see a lot of, I'm just going to own it, Sherry, therapy admits. I knew as a former rehab director that if there was a therapy admit on a Friday, a good chunk of them were going to end up not till next week because the patient doesn't want it, which used to make me wonder, did they not want it, or did you kind of facilitate the I'm tired? Oh, how about we just do this next week? Anyhow, sidebar. But the issue in hand being the patient requested a delay. You weren't able to call the doctor to get an updated date of referral. So as written, that original date of referral of 110 would stand. And yes, the start of care date is 114. This is where we have to, how can I put this? The issue around some of this is I think we need to be honest in the data we report. And I know some people say, you know how hard it is to do that because I know the other agencies just, manipulate the order or they just put a different date in there. I have audited agencies where it's like, seriously, your date of referral and your start of care date match 100% of the time. Highly doubtful that you're going out the exact same day you got that order. This may be an attempt to just make it look like timeliness is really good. But there are situations like this one as described that the 48 hours was already maxing out when you try to contact them. The fact the physician was not available to delay it 2 more days and be okay with that. I think part of it is, we don't want to look bad on the timeliness issue, but take that item out of it for a minute. The physician ordered that on the 10th, expecting within the next couple of days that person would start home care. The patient has the right to say, I don't want to do this until the 14th, but that contact with the physician is not just so I have another order and my timeliness is fixed. It's to make sure the physician is okay with the delay. And I know I can hear some eye rolling is the doctor doesn't care. The doctor doesn't pay that much attention, blah, blah, blah. Okay, forget it. The doctor is the one who ordered it. And the doctor may say, no, I can't really have them wait that long. Or this is what, you're going to have to call them back, or those things can happen. So that's why that step is what has to happen to officially move the date. So in that case, the 102 is again skipped. He didn't have a specific, and you're stuck with the original referral date because there was no updated one from the physician.
Okay, that makes it clear, and I like how you tied that to what the patient needs and what the physician wanted for the patient, because we actually got a COP this year that addresses what we have available and how we're supposed to report that, and it also addresses some of the other things surrounding that. Cindy, do you mind mentioning why that seems to be a hot button issue right now?
Well, it seems to be driven a lot by advocacy groups, beneficiary advocacy groups, and discharge planners in terms of the difficulties of being able to place someone in a home health agency, and advocacy groups concerned that agencies are accepting a referral, but then either taking an extraordinary amount of time to get started, or once they accept the patient, say, oh yeah, by the way, I don't have an aide and I don't do OT. Well, that really should be upfront. If the patient needs those and you don't have them, we don't just get to pretend that they don't need them. So that whole COP, tedious as it may seem to some, is really meant to proactively be upfront with what you have, what you don't have, and if there's any delays in those, so that an informed decision can be made and timely in terms of not having discharge planners having to call 3, 4, 5 different home health agencies to figure out who has availability. Now, Sherry, since you opened that can of worms, I'm going to step one piece further on that.
Go ahead.
As I'm trying to get the word out. This whole discussion of services we have or don't have, I think everybody's pretty clear. If I don't have an aide, obviously I don't have an aide. If I don't have OT, I don't have OT. But it's a bit more nuanced than that. And we had that confirmed on a podcast that we hosted with Mary Carr from what is now called the Alliance, that this goes into certain areas of service provision within any of those disciplines. Case in point, if your organization has taken the position that you do not provide maintenance therapy, that is one of the things that has to be disclosed, because that is part of the Medicare Part A home health benefit. And if a patient qualifies for and would benefit from a maintenance approach to care, and you don't do that, that is a part of what also needs to be disclosed. And that should have been occurring the entire time. Agencies that have said, I don't understand it, or I don't like it, or my clinicians aren't okay with it, fine. you can make that decision, but it's no different than if you made the decision that you didn't want to deal with wound care patients. You have to disclose that, and you can't take somebody with a wound and say, well, I don't do wound care, so oh well. No, you have to be upfront with that. So I thought that was a piece, Sherry, that I'm not seeing a lot of discussion about, of disclosing the lack of maintenance therapy. But Mary was very clear that examples like that are part of what should be in our policies and procedures related to that COP.
Thank you for clarifying that, Cindy, because it's something that's under scrutiny right now. And so we need to be aware of that and why it's under scrutiny. We're still somewhere around 60+% not taking folks under care that are referred to home health. And that's getting a little frustrating for those discharge planners and for the community-based referrals as well. So just be aware that that's under scrutiny and have a plan and a process for that. Okay, Cindy, ready to move on? I want to tell everyone about Club Oasis. If you haven't heard about Club Oasis, it's because you don't get our emails. If you don't get our emails, please feel free to use our email at the end of this session to reach out to find out more about Club Oasis. But Club Oasis goes into those details and discussion points, it's like Cindy just did with this item, and explains a little bit more about the why and gives you that context and gives you tools in order to help your clinicians understand it better. And next question, ready, Cindy?
Yep.
In home health care, does PT/OT speech need to add a therapy diagnosis on their evaluation? Our QA department said that is not needed, but now that part of the plan of care that the MD signs is blank and all other diagnoses from the start of care are listed as medical history.
Well, Sherry, I'm going to be tagging you in at some point on this because I am not the coder on this in our group. But the issue about a therapy diagnosis, there is no such thing as a therapy diagnosis.
What?
There never was. It happened organically with this whole, well, we got to make a reason. So we saw a lot of this muscle weakness, gait instability, and my personal favorite in the heyday was abnormality of gait.
Oh,
If
yeah.
you were getting PT, abnormality of gait was going on there. And I argued back in the time, even before I even had my limited understanding of coding, Sherry, is what does that actually say? It says they walk funny. That's all it says. It doesn't say why. It doesn't say what the underlying cause is. It doesn't say what it's related to. It's you walk funny. And oh, if it's OT, then we're going to use weakness. So it's like, okay, hold on. These don't describe anything in detail, but they let us do it. So it organically became these are therapy diagnoses. We have to have these, and it has to be something that fits with therapy. Well, we know what happened when we went to PDGM, which was those are not useful codes. They don't really tell us anything. So if you try to put those as primary, we're kicking this thing out because this doesn't really tell us anything. And it became, now what do we do for therapy? Technically, what we should have been doing the entire time, which is what is the underlying cause? Because it could still be a problem as a PT, it could still be a problem with their gait, but the problems of gait associated with Parkinson's versus a knee replacement versus a CHF exacerbation can be very different. And so the comfort level then became therapists weren't okay with that because we went through kind of a learning curve of, so if it's a PT admit, I put heart failure as the primary. I'm not treating the heart failure. Okay, hold on. If that's what's driving the issue, that is what needs to be there. Are we going to monitor a few things related to that in terms of any weight gain? Are they taking their medication? Yes, because if their heart failure starts going off the rails, I'm calling for nursing reinforcement. I have no qualms about doing that. But it helps to create that picture that coding is supposed to of what are the underlying actual diagnoses that have meaning that correlate to this. Now, Sherry, I know that there are some diagnoses that have these symptom type codes embedded in them, correct?
Yes, for sure. And one of them, for example, is heart failure. You don't code shortness of breath or difficulty breathing with heart failure. It's assumed to be integral to the diagnosis. And so there's a lot of diagnoses. When you look at them and you say, okay, a hip fracture or a hip repair, is it integral to that they would have muscle weakness associated with that? Or hip pain associated with that. It seems easier to accept for some reason by clinicians and by QA staff that you would leave the pain off. I mean, obviously they've had surgery. Well, as a therapist, I would argue that you leave the weakness off because they had an ongoing pathology that led them to the hip replacement, or they had a weakness that caused the fracture that caused the fall that led them. So that, again, telling the story about how that patient got to where they got is so important. That was such great grammar, Cindy. Sorry about that. Got to where they got to, is so important, so that you can figure out and suss out, and the clinician can suss out which of these diagnoses that are being presented in front of me actually cause this weakness, actually cause this debility. That's the diagnoses that should be put on your plan of care and on your list of diagnoses if you're going to do that.
Well, but Sherry, I would also argue that part of the problem with the abnormality of gait and the weakness is then you would read therapy evaluations where the gait assessment is simply distance, device, and level of assistance, regardless of medical diagnosis. Those are the same three things that are there that don't really ever speak to what is the actual gait abnormality. Less distance than a greater distance is not the abnormality. So the details of a gait assessment and then what are those interventions to target those specifically really boost the medical necessity as opposed to just going for walks. Or you have weakness and then you get to a manual muscle test that I'm not even sure actually gets done when it's 3+ in every single field. And then there's really no correlation presented in the documentation of the cause of the weakness and what we think it's going to take. And then, Sherry, it does me in when we're going to strengthen them in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Man, I wish you're going to strengthen them in 4 treatment visits in 2 weeks. That's it. My gym membership's going to be 2 weeks long and I'm done.
Exactly.
But I want to circle back to part of that question said, well, now there's a field on the plan of care that's blank. A therapy diagnosis is not a required field. There's a rehab prognosis issue potentially, but not a diagnosis. So if specific to this question, if there's something there that's now blank, I would want to revisit that in terms of, much like we said about the EMR, maybe it shouldn't even be there.
Right.
If it's not a required element and you can get it off of there, I would do that. But I noticed a question came in, Sherry, and I want to pull it in now because it does relate to our topic at hand.
Okay.
The question is, has CMS changed the provision that PT can no longer provide a one-visit start of care? Is PT now considered like nursing, that there must be intermittent care, so more than one visit is needed? The answer to that is no. Nothing has changed from CMS that says that it has to be intermittent therapy. Unless someone has seen that somewhere and wants to share that link with Sherry and I, and we get, let everybody else know that. But to my knowledge, nothing has changed about that. I will say, though, as someone who's been in this space 30 years, I have a hard time with many of what I end up seeing as therapy only one visit, whether it's the admission visit or it's an evaluation only visit. I see a lot of those visits containing recommendations, suggestions, equipment thoughts, move this piece of furniture, and then here is your exercise program. And you're not going back. I have concerns, and I very often think that that correlates to some misunderstandings around maintenance therapy, because a lot of these fit with the, I gave you this stuff, there's no potential for them to improve. They don't have to have the potential to improve, but if you're going to hand out things that you want them to do in your absence, at least one more visit to make sure that what you gave them is effective, that it didn't cause something else to go wrong that was unforeseen. I mean, you would want to follow up, and it didn't necessarily mean 2 days from now, it could be in a week. But I think we really need to be careful with those single visits to say, yes, technically CMS says we can do this with a start of care. But on the other hand, if I've made these kinds of recommendations or suggestions, it is my responsibility to make sure that this stuff actually works and doesn't inadvertently cause harm.
Okay. I think that answered that pretty well, considering that I thought it was going to open up even a bigger can of worms, Cindy, because we've been on the soapbox since the beginning of K&K 12 years ago about the one visit and gone, the eval onlys, if you will. I think any discipline needs to be concerned about that, particularly in home health, because our patients can change within a few hours, not just days. And so I think that if you're going to make more than one visit or add some PRN visits, it should be at a different time of the day. What do you think about that, Cindy?
Well, yeah, because I always remember trying to schedule a PT visit. I don't want you to come in the morning. That's when I'm awful. And you basically want to say, I need to see you when you're awful. I need to see you at the times of the day you find most difficult. I think this still goes back to the perception of the patient population that therapy is going to come and wear spandex and have a whistle and make them you drop and do 20. So I need to feel good enough to do the therapy, and doesn't understand that we're in there to help figure out those problem spots. So I would agree that, especially that discussion during that initial visit of, are there times a day that are harder? Are there certain activities? Well, he's pretty good today, but he's got a doctor's appointment next week, and every time we go to the doctor and come back, he's a mess. Okay, well, I'm going to schedule then my next visit after you come back from the doctor. Oh, no, he won't be able to exercise. Okay, fine. I want to see functionally what's happened now from him going to a doctor's appointment and how we can possibly troubleshoot this so it's not such a huge effort for them and they don't come back and lay in bed for 2 days.
Right. If you like some of this advice, I'm going to put up the slide again about our outsourcing. We want to be your compliance partner. And one of the things that we do in charts that we audit or charts that we have on a day-to-day basis is we add in these special tips and things to keep you going forward, to be your guardrails and to say, hey, this is okay on an occasion, but you need to make it a rare occurrence versus something that can be part of your new practice. And so we kind of pride ourselves on that. And I know a lot of you are saying, well, I have my outsourcing is in-house and all that thing, but look, but we also do audits, and we have had a run on audits recently, and it's a way to prevent an ADR stopping you in your tracks. And so if you have the need for an audit, or if you want someone to discuss this with and see what would be the best tool to assist your agency in moving forward, use this QR code, scan it, and it'll take you straight to the contact us button, the outsource button, and just set up a call. It's free and there's no obligation whatsoever. And you get to have a partner that's going to be there for you through thick and thin and through all the changes in the regulations to make sure that you're staying on track. Okay, question number 5, Cindy. We're a little over halfway done. Okay, when answering the M questions, your favorite one, Cindy, should we consider physical capacity of the caregiver in our scoring? For example, patient whose elderly spouse tries to assist the patient does not always do the best job and also has difficulty with the transfer in and out of the shower. Should that be scored a 5 or a 6 if both the patient and the caregiver demonstrate safety concerns and both need training from an OT? So then comparing this to another patient whose daughter is physically capable of providing assistance for getting into the shower and able to provide successful assistance to the bathroom portion, would that in turn be more consistent with a 3?
So when we look at the guidance around the assessment of function in the 1800s, it talks about identifying assistance is needed, whether or not it's actually available. So I think we look at it from one angle and say, so we're comfortable saying that the person needs assistance to complete this task. So let's say their ambulation is a 3 or their bathing is a 3, that they would need someone involved throughout, even when they live alone. We've harped on that for 2 decades to say, yes, it's about what assistance do they need to be successful. And if I say you're a 3 and you don't have anybody, then what are we going to do about this? And that's why the clinicians often get stuck in the what's my liability? I'm not comfortable doing it. And we go through the same dance we've been doing for decades. But the instructions have said it's about what your assessment determines needs to occur, whether or not it's available. So if I'm comfortable and saying that you need to be a 3 in bathing and you live alone, that's really no different than I think you're a 3 in bathing and the person you live with is not really capable of providing that. I don't downgrade the person's ability off of the effectiveness of their caregiver. So I would approach it, and especially if there's pushback from clinicians, of saying, here's the deal, it is about what you think they need to be safe. And if you're going to apply that standard of putting those response items when no one's here, it doesn't get to become worse because someone is here who's having some problem.
That makes sense to me. Okay, second question of this one's sent in a double question. It's regarding SCICs. Is the purpose of a SCIC to capture a significant change, positive or negative? Why does this type of visit not reset the OASIS data in the way that a ROC does?
Well, it's interesting. We still hear the term SCIC, significant change in condition, but that technically doesn't even exist as an OASIS time point. It's in there as a follow-up. The intent of using a follow-up, of saying, okay, we have our start of care, we know what a resumption of care is, we know what a recert is, why throw in this other one? It's really meant to be agency discretion if they think there has been a significant enough change to warrant doing it. And yes, it does factor in from an outcome standpoint. So the issue is, and I've always found this interesting, Sherry, because it references, do it if there's been a significant change for the negative. It has also always said if there's a significant change to the positive, which I have never, ever seen anybody fill one out because the patient got unexpectedly better. And if we think about it, if we're talking about a significant change, I believe that's more often than not captured with a resumption of care after a transfer to an inpatient facility. That's typically where something has really gone wrong and they ended up in the hospital, they come back, and now we are resetting baseline because they've been out of our possession. I don't see a lot of these other follow-ups being done. I think it's really about setting agency standards about what are we calling a significant change. CMS does not dictate that. They're leaving it to our discretion, but I don't see very many of them actually being completed because yes, there's changes. And sometimes, we say, well, if they got worse, but the issue is, was it unexpected? And being realistic, there are some of our patients that when things start to decline, nobody's actually shocked. And the reality is, though, our plan of care should have been written to highlight that we do expect this. Now, what if we write it expecting in our goal statements that they may be worse than when we started with them? That's part of what my frustration was when we had the goals column in the GGs and everybody was going to be independent by discharge no matter what. No, there are patients that we know are going to decline. And if they're on a decline trajectory and they're declining, that would not be a significant change in condition because you expected it.
Right. And I think that, where I've seen the other come in is with a cancer diagnosis, for example. A lot of times they'll come home with having all the tests run while they're in inpatient, but no definitive cancer diagnosis or cancer treatment plan. So if you had a patient that all of a sudden 2 weeks into their home care realized that the lung cancer was a positive test and that they're going to be starting chemotherapy, and that chemotherapy is impacting their wellness and impacting their ability to do things, I think that's a great time for an other OASIS time point, because in that way you will capture the treatments that are going to be provided to that patient that maybe are different from the start. So doing a plan of care add-on order is also important at those times. Did you have anything else for that one?
Nope.
Okay, and we had a question come in about a GG. I'm going to do that before I'm going to end on a BIM, Cindy, which is your favorite. Okay, our clinicians still get confused on what setup is for 1870 and GG0130. Any suggestions here? I do see in guidance it includes opening milk, pouring on cereal or in coffee, cutting up food. Not sure if they really assess these items correctly.
Well, I think first of all, and not directed to the person who asked the question, big picture first. We know that the attention on 1870 and GG130 escalated anytime a question gets pulled into either the reimbursement model, to outcomes, to VBP, or any combination of the three. To me, the biggest issue I see around properly assessing both of those questions is that the preparation of the food, the carrying of the food, the bringing the food to the table is excluded for both. And I know this, we did a webinar with MedBridge earlier this week, and I used some polling questions. And one of the scenarios I used is about these two particular items in terms of describing a patient who needs to use a walker all the time. The family has taken over meal preparation and has to bring the food to the table. The scenario does describe that the patient can use their utensils perfectly fine and has no issues with chewing or swallowing. The attendees responded overwhelmingly incorrectly by saying that this was some sort of assistance, that this was setting them up. And the guidance is extremely clear that this is only about putting food successfully into your body once the food is placed in front of you. So my concern is that I'm seeing a lot of scoring that is not independent, used to be independent, and now all of a sudden they're not, none of them are. But there's no explanation as to what the problem actually is. Is it that they can't, get the food to their mouth, that they need us to be supervised because there's a concern about them choking, or they need some help in getting the cup lifted? Then someone's involved. And again, supervision in 1870 does lump into that. But my biggest issue to make sure they're assessing it properly is to make sure they're assessing the task at hand and not elaborating it to, well, he can't make the food, he can't carry the food, he can't, put the food on the table. None of that is relevant to this either one of those questions.
Okay. It looks like this could be our last question, Cindy, if it sets you off like I think it might. I want everyone to have the opportunity, though, to look at our last slide, which is our informational slide. And it gives you our email addresses. And please send us any questions that you have in the interim. And if you have questions that you just want to be added to our next session, which is May 15th at 1 p.m., please send those on the emails. We save them and we add them in. But if you need something answered immediately, just indicate that and we'll definitely get back to you as soon as we can. But we appreciate everyone's participation. We have such a good group that shows up each time we do one of these. And if you have any feedback or suggestions, or I don't know, add a girls or not a girls, that you want to send to Cindy and I and let us know how we're doing and what you think of these sessions and how they could be improved, or if they've solved some deep-seated discussion in your agency, let us know about that. It kind of gives us some energy to move along. Okay, Cindy, the BIMS, your favorite. Should the BIMS results be used to answer M1700 on the OASIS? There are some educational tools out there that state 0 to 4 BIMS means a 1700 of 4. 5 to 7 means a 3 or a 4. 8 to 10, a 3. 11 to 12, a 2. 13 to 15 on the BIMS means a 0 or a 1. Is this an accurate way to answer M1700?
Okay, so the issue at hand is, if this is a suggestion to pay attention to the relationship between how they did on the BIMS and what you choose for 1700, I can see that. What my concern is this looks like it's a formula, and I would only accept that as a direct correlation if it was in the official guidance manual. I say that because there's nothing there that links how you answer the BIMS to how you answer 1700. Do I think there's value in considering it? Yes, but my opinion is irrelevant when it comes to what the official guidance says. So if this is not coming from CMS, if this is not a response to a Q&A, if this is not found in the official guidance manual, I would not say it's a hard and fast, give it to the clinician and then tell them anytime they have a 6 on the BIMS, it's a 3 or a 4. Do I think it's reasonable to say if you got a 4 on the BIMS, how did you get a 0 in 1700? Yeah, these things should make sense together. So I like the idea of thinking about it, but Sherry, it reminded me of some of the issues I have with scrubbers, because a scrubber is an amazing tool to point out if I missed a question entirely, or to say, have you considered this? Because there still needs to be that human decision making. When someone says we do our OASIS review solely by the scrubber, wait a minute, but there's other nuance pieces to it that a scrubber doesn't catch. And just because a scrubber said something was wrong, I know they say certain codes are wrong and their information is wrong. So pointing out something so that I pay attention to it is one thing. Correlating it hard and fast is something else. So do I think this is, again, food for thought to help clinicians make the connection between the two? Yes. But I can't endorse 11 to 12 on the BIMS means 1700 as a 2. Unless CMS said that they were okay with that correlation. Because we have to remember, the BIMS is a standardized and validated tool outside of OASIS. 1700 is back into the discipline neutral data collection, time points created for an intent purpose. It is not a clinical assessment. It doesn't correlate to diagnoses directly. It's more about a data snapshot. So I would just be cautious with that relationship.
something like that is not the same as the fall risk assessment that we had embedded in the OASIS during OASIS D. And what that meant was if you scored a certain number because it was a standardized test, then that meant you were at risk for fall, so you could answer another item that way. It is not the same direct connection like that is, correct?
Yes.
And
I think, and the correlation there is different, Sherry, because we stand by that today. If someone is considered at risk for falls, do you think they should be at least supervised this day of assessment as they're doing these functional tasks? That is taking the results of that test and helping to use it to make decisions about safety to then choose the appropriate OASIS answer. The way this is worded is it's telling you that the BIMS score tells you what to put in 1700. And the BIMS wasn't designed to correlate to 1700 in OASIS. But I'm going to say it again. I think it's a valuable tool to discuss. And definitely as a reviewer, I wouldn't mind keeping that around just in case, because there's times our OASIS review team here at K&K says that, I got this score here, and then they put a 0 over there. It could be helpful for that as well, but I just would stay away from it being a formula.
exactly. And Cindy, we have a couple more questions. And anybody has any additional questions before we leave today, please get them into the chat box and we'll grab them and get them as soon as we possibly can. But we'll go ahead and do question number 7. How does answering M2420 as unknown impact the outcome measures or HH value-based purchasing, or does it not impact these?
So 2420 is discharge disposition. We know that part of this issue related to VBP does look at claims data. And we have to keep in mind that 2420 is really now very narrow in terms of did they continue with home health services or not. It doesn't encompass anything else. So if you think about the ability to verify that, if it was marked as unknown, theoretically, and Medicare's looking at claims data, they would know if this person went to another home health agency because another claim would show up in that period of time. So unknown is a very, very small part. Sometimes it might seem like there's a run of them for some inexplicable reason, but I think any of those responses that I agree, does it impact what happens with it? I think sometimes those unknowns get used because they're easier. I don't really know, so I'm going to put that. Putting a little bit of effort into it, talking to the patient about this, their family, what they're going to continue with or not continue with if they're leaving the area. Okay, there's an unknown version for that says because they're out of my geographical area, but really trying to make sure responses like unknown or the use of the dash are as minimal as possible. And especially the dash, CMS has been very clear every time they put it in the guidance manual. Basically, this should be a rare occurrence. But I think sometimes it becomes, well, that's just faster. So I don't see it having a huge impact on this. But you want to make sure that it's an anomaly and not just a routine occurrence.
Okay. I got to jump in here with one last question or one more question and hit the GG items. Okay, while I understand the ANA codes have been identified with the CMS final rule that agencies have been using too many of these to answer the GG items, and we encourage our staff to only use these if applicable or as a last resort. I recently heard that CMS has encouraged agencies to stop using the codes 0, 7, and 10, and that they may eventually be removed as choices altogether in the future. I find no reference to this. Have you heard the same?
Well, there's multiple things I enjoy about this question, Sherry. First of all, I love the fact that the person who asked it started with, we encourage our staff to only use these if applicable and as a last resort. I am so happy it doesn't say we told them not to use them. We've had that rant on other Q&As and on podcasts. I think anyone who's heard me knows my position on this whole don't touch them with a 10-foot pole. They've all, they're terrible, never ever use them is extreme. But hats off to, yes, I completely agree. They're still in play, but they really should be a last resort and not just the path of least resistance. When anybody starts with, I've heard that CMS has said, and as the question reads, goes on and can't find it anywhere, is where we start to question, did CMS really say that, or did someone think they heard something? And so that's why it's so important and why K&K, works really hard that if we're going to say something was said by CMS, that resource is there. It's very clear. And if it's our opinion, we're going to say it's our opinion. But to my knowledge, and I do participate in the technical expert panel related to home health value-based purchasing, and the issue of the ANA codes comes up because of the whole how do they factor into the calculation and all that other rigmarole. There's been no discussion on those about getting rid of 7 or 10. There was a lot of debate about those in terms of if it's an environmental issue, how can a home health agency change that in terms of trying to improve the patient situation? Patient refusal is patient refusal. I don't know. I mean, you can't make them, I guess. But there, I think, again, utilizing the 4, understanding the 4, the big difference between the 8, can't do it now, but could do it before, and the 9, can't do it now, couldn't do it before. Again, there's nothing I've seen that says they're specifically looking to remove any of those codes. I think some of the pushback has been, well, if you're going to, for value-based purchasing, use some magic math to turn my ANA code into something else. I know I, as a member of the panel, didn't like that very much. It's like, well, if you can make up a different answer out of it, why can't the clinician who's actually seeing the patient? But that's a story for another day. But no, I haven't seen anything either that's getting rid of any of them. So if it truly is the only answer we have left after vetting all possible other options, we should continue to use any of those 4 ANA codes. But I've always found it interesting when I've seen use of patient refusal, and then in other parts of the assessment, you said they could do that, especially if you look at it against the 1800s. So you got enough to assess that, but then you got over here and they refused to do it. Again, I think we were a little fast and loose with them prior and need to tighten that up considerably, but they're not going anywhere to my knowledge at this point.
Oh,
And,
exactly.
and real quick, Sherry, because those are embedded in the GG questions that are present in inpatient rehab tools, the tool for the SNF and for the long-term acute care hospitals. So we could never unilaterally just get rid of them for home care because that would mean all 4 settings would have to lose 7 and 10 as well. And that I'm not hearing any discussion about.
And one of our listeners says she can't imagine that they would do without the patient refuse code or the lack of equipment.
Mhm.
If they don't have a car, you can't do a car transfer. If they refuse, you need to be able to report that. Just a thought she couldn't hold in. Thank you, Roberta.
No, it is true because there are going to be those situations where that is what you don't have a car. What do you want me to do? I mean, I'm not going to go get a car and stick you in it. So, I mean, those things, but again, back to the question answer, that was some of the maybe used too much in the past that I think we're going to right size how we're communicating that information to CMS. And then we're going to have to wait and see what happens with VBP. This is how they've started it in terms of imputing that into different answers that may or may not work out long term. So we'll just have to keep an eye on that going forward.
And before we go, we need to say happy spring. Today is the first day of spring, and I know some of you are experiencing spring-like weather and enjoying the heck out of it, while those of you up in the Wisconsin area, like Cindy's son, just got a foot of snow with dirty hail yesterday or the day before, right, Cindy?
Oh, yeah. And I started out today at 50. It was 78 yesterday. It's 50 right now. And we have a freeze warning tonight. So it's like, I'm not sure it's spring. But what I wanted to highlight, Sherry, is how come you've got all that St. Patrick's stuff on those slides today?
Because St. Patrick's Day is K&K Decision Day. We met in Nashville at a pub on St. Patrick's Day and decided to form a company, which we opened on June 1st of the same year. We are 12 years old, and we would not be here without each and every one of you that choose to use us for guidance in these situations. So thank you so much for being a listener, and thank you for subscribing to our email. And we'll see you again on May 15th. And Cindy, thank you for putting up with me for 12 years.
Right back at you, Sherry.
Everyone have a great day, and please be safe out there.